Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The French police, heroically I must say, ended the career of the mass murderer and ISIS mastermind Abdelhamid Abaaoud.
The problem is, there are a lot more where he came from, and nobody in our political class seems to know how to stop the multiplying recruitment of those who are all too ready to sacrifice their own lives for as many others as they can take with them.
On the contrary, our leaders repeatedly prove Einstein's maxim that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the very definition of madness.
Having spent the last 4.5 years making ISIS and Al-Qaeda stronger in the Levant, they ask us to believe that they are now the men to sort out the mess they've been creating, not for the last 15 days, but for decades.
And moreover, to persist in the madness of fighting ISIS and the Syrian regime simultaneously, and with no UN authorization, and in confrontation, politically at least, with Syria's allies. Joining us to discuss the critical juncture at which we now stand is political analyst, writer and broadcaster John Wight. John, neither you nor I are liberals, neither are we pacifists. Surely the question here is not that something must be done, but what must be done. Not if, but how.
Absolutely. What was a regional conflict is now undeniably a global one. In short order, we've had the downing of the Russian airliner over the Sinai, followed by carnage in Beirut, carnage in Nigeria, and carnage most recently on the streets of Paris. So this undeniably demands an overwhelming response. The question is, as you say, on what basis that response comes. The narrative that there is any equivalence between President Bashar al-Assad and the people that he is fighting in Syria is now no longer tenable, if it ever was tenable. Neither is the narrative that Putin should be regarded as an enemy or as somebody who's hostile to our interests. We need to form a united front. And these unilateralists, and unfortunately we have a government that is still plagued with unilateralism on this issue, unless they come to that understanding, they will deepen the crisis rather than alleviate it, because it will lock us into a collision course with Russia, Iran and the Syrian governments. The vast majority of people fighting on the ground are Muslims, the Muslims of the Syrian Arab Army, Hezbollah, Iranian Revolutionary Guards and volunteers, and the Kurds. And we must align our efforts with them now. We should have done it long before now, but now it has to be done.
In fact, for the last 4.5 years, we've been doing the opposite, haven't we? We've been backing them, giving them money, directly or indirectly, giving them weapons, giving them political and propaganda support, calling them freedom fighters, revolutionaries, even while they were eating people's hearts and cutting off heads by the hundreds, if not thousands. And what's needed now is a sharp U-turn by Western countries, not into pacifism. Neither of us would for a moment contemplate that we should just be a kind of punch bag waiting for the next suicide unit to turn up, but make alliances with the people that are already fighting them. I've never understood why that's so difficult. What is it about Bashar al-Assad that means we can't make an alliance with him and his friends to crush these people?
Well, fortunately, what we're seeing, George, is the fact that statecraft today is dying on its feet as a craft. When David Cameron talks about striking the head of the snake, as he did recently with regards to British airstrikes in Raqqa, he was wrong. The head of the snake, to extend the metaphor, is in Saudi Arabia. So why is that alliance still ongoing? That alliance must end. It must be reconsidered as a matter of urgency. Everybody can see it except him and British arms dealers who benefit from this alliance. No one else benefits from this alliance. This is a medieval kleptocracy, and the poison and extremism which we are fighting emanates from there and has done for decades, and it's now reached a point of critical mass. So you're right, there must be a realignment on all fronts regarding our geopolitical interests and regarding how we deal with this as a security issue at home. With regards to shoot to kill, I think we should go on to that. There is a distinction to be drawn with people who are formulating plans to carry out these kinds of attacks and people who are in the process of carrying them out. It is not right to go and shoot and kill people who are in the process of formulating plans. But if someone is prancing around the streets of London wielding an AK-47 and wearing a suicide belt, it is simply not credible to read them their rights. They must be shot and dealt with appropriately.
I'd pull the trigger myself. Yeah. I'd be happy to see every ISIS terrorist lying dead in the street. Again, it's not about if, it's about how. Exactly. If you handle this the wrong way, as I said 4 days after 9/11 in Parliament when it was recalled, if you handle this the wrong way, you'll make 10,000 new bin Ladens. Indeed. I underestimated that, to be sure, but you'll make hundreds of thousands of new ISIS fighters and people ready to kill themselves if they can kill you and as many of us as they can take with them.
Yes. I mean, the first order of business, we have to eradicate the physical presence of ISIS/Daesh in Syria and in Iraq. That has to be done on the basis of a united front. The ideology which fuels this menace is a different matter. That's going to be a longer-term struggle, and that has to be more nuanced. That involves how we deal with the Muslim community here. The vast majority of Muslims, overwhelming majority of Muslims, hate this menace even more than we do. As I said earlier, they're the ones who are doing the fighting and then dying on the ground against these sectarian mass murders. The only division that matters in that region is not between Sunni and Shia, Christian, Muslim, non-Muslim, atheist or secularist. It is between sectarian and non-sectarian forces, and we should be on the side of non-sectarian forces. And as you say, if we go in there blundering as we've done in the past, then we will just give fuel to the fire and increase support for sectarian forces. So we have to be very, very careful.
Why can't they ally with, you mentioned President Putin earlier, the Russian military intervention in Syria has been devastatingly successful. Of course, it doesn't deal with the causes. No. We deal with the causes after we've staunched the symptoms. But in terms of attacking the symptoms, the Russian armed forces have been devastatingly successful.
Yes, they have.
Why can't Obama and Cameron and Hollande say, we're joining up with Russia to end this menace on that battlefield? We'll disagree, no doubt, about what has to happen next. But there will be no next if we can't staunch the blood flow that is coming from these people.
Well, as we saw from the G8, the noises coming out are much more positive than they have been in the wake of this carnage. The body language alone from the meeting that we were privileged to see between President Obama and Vladimir Putin, when it was just them and their translators present, shows that engagement has been much more meaningful than it ever has. That has to continue. There's peace talks being scheduled to start in Vienna with Syrian opposition groups in January. Concrete results must arise from those talks. But I think the problem has been they've been locked into this attitude of unipolarity that's a hangover from previous administrations. The collapse of the Soviet Union, it was greeted with triumphalism, the end of history nonsense, and the idea that America should rule the world like ancient Rome. When George W. Bush emerged from his bunker 3 days after the attack on 9/11, he did so as the enemy, the modern incarnation of the ancient Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus, and they wanted to redraw the world in America's image. It was a neocon project for a new American century strategy. That can no longer be allowed to intrude on global affairs. Russia is a viable partner, so is China. We need a multipolar alternative to unipolarity that has dragged us into this mess. This is the cause of the crisis that we are facing today. So they have to accept that. And I think there is starting to be a grudging acceptance of that, but it certainly can't come quick enough.
At that level, because the public itself, although it's obviously a confusing message, first they want to kill, get rid of Assad, and now they're trying to make clear that actually we need to work together with him. The public has can see through that. They saw from the beginning that look, we've got one greater enemy. Of course, Assad has done bad things, but the bigger enemy is ISIS, and the public sees
Absolutely,
that.
absolutely. I mean, we're talking about a group of sectarians who are intent on turning Syria and Iraq into a mass grave for minorities, Muslim and non-Muslim alike.
It's like Pol Pot. It's
Yes,
a return
Khmer
to the
Rouge.
year zero.
It's not about Islamism. It's not anything that's Islamic. You're right. The Khmer Rouge were not Muslims. The Nazis weren't Muslims. It's a reflex against modernity that arises out of conditions of crisis and war that we cause. I'm talking about the West. If you look at the issue in Cambodia, that was a direct result of the US extending its bombing campaign to Cambodia and producing societal collapse, out of which this menace and this reaction emerged in the form of the Khmer Rouge. We're looking at a very distinct parallel here in the Middle East with the rise of IS. When we went into Iraq, we unlocked the gates of hell. And another important aspect of this that hasn't been mentioned yet, following on from that, is we need to ensure that justice in the case of Tony Blair is served, because he was the man, he played a key role in unlocking those gates of hell, and he has to pay a heavy, heavy price, because it was from those gates of hell, from that hell, that this monster has emerged.
I wish we could talk all day, but we're just time for one last question. This is a snake with more than one head, actually. You're right that Riyadh is a kind of ideological and financial fountainhead. Yeah. But none of this could have happened without the collaboration with ISIS and Al-Qaeda of the Turkish state.
Yeah.
Now, Turkey is a member of NATO,
Yeah.
the same alliance as us. Saudi Arabia is always, we're always told, is our best friend in the Arab world. How is it possible that NATO and the friends of Saudi Arabia cannot tell them that it cannot be business as usual? You have to stop what you're doing and start doing the opposite. I mean, aren't these countries, in the case of Saudi Arabia, at least a client state? I mean, who's wagging the dog or the tail?
Well, I think we have to understand the US is not the same animal in terms of its projection of imperial power as it was in 2003. It's been severely weakened after a decade of failed wars and occupations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we saw the fact that the US took a backseat under Obama when it came to regime change in Libya. I think the problem has been is that the US doesn't have the resources anymore, and its regional allies are now following their own regional agenda, which are inimical to the US agenda of stability, of returning stability to a region that has now been destabilised. And so we know for a fact that Riyadh and Erdogan were fuming at the decision not to proceed with armed strikes against Assad and his forces in 2013, and I think they followed their own policy in the wake of that, and it's just undermined all efforts to get a handle on this growing crisis. But this now is being laid bare, and you're right, there is a very, very murky relationship between the Erdogan government and this IS group, because we know they would not have been able to function without the ability to pass men and materiel back and forward across the Turkish border. And one of the most grievous injustices of this whole episode and this whole conflict has been the way that the Turks turned on the Kurds, the heroic defenders of Kobani, when their tanks sat and watched this going on, and they managed to beat off these ISIS hordes, and they've now started airstrikes against the very people who only registered the only defeat hitherto against IS. It doesn't get any more worse than that.
Foul, not murky. Yes. Foul. Indeed. John Wight, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.
Coming up next, a British Muslim perspective on what all of this means for his co-religionist is broadcaster Roshan Salih. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Sputnik.
Something approaching a state of siege now exists for Europe's millions of Muslim citizens. Even before the events in Paris, YouTube clips proliferated of usually defenseless Muslim women and pensioners being assaulted on public transport or playing in the street.
Just before les événements, a video emerged of an 81-year-old man pushing a Muslim woman into the path of an oncoming London tube train. A clue, you might think, both to the rise of anti-Muslim hatred in Britain and a deepening of the pool of alienation in which the ISIS and Al-Qaeda terrorists swim. Broadcaster Roshan Salih is one of the most acute observers of the Muslim community in Britain and in Europe, and he joins us now. Roshan, thanks for coming on board the Sputnik. You've got your finger on the pulse. How worried are the Muslims in Britain and Europe today, and are they right to be?
Yes, they are right to be. I mean, I think, George, Islamophobia is at unprecedented levels all across Europe. I used to live in France. I did a documentary recently on French Muslims, and it's actually a lot worse in France than it is in Britain. I mean, France is a very aggressive secular. It's laïcité, it's secularism, is a very aggressive secularism, a secularism which considers a veil to be a threat to the state if it's worn in a school. Islamophobia and racism are almost mainstream, not only in French government, but perhaps also in French society, which is even more worrying. In Britain, I think we have our problems here, but it's a much more kind of a liberal type of secularism that British Muslims have to, adhere to.
This aggressive secularism of the French state will not have been dampened by the events, of course. And the fact that the killers appear largely to have come from Belgium, if not further afield, will not protect the French Muslims from what comes next. What do you think's coming next?
Well, I mean, if you look for the last year after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January, what the French state did was they militarized society. If you go to France now, there are literally thousands of soldiers on the streets, usually protecting the Eiffel Tower and places like that, but the synagogues especially. They're not protecting mosques. And if you actually look at the number of attacks which have taken place since the Charlie Hebdo incident, it's usually against Muslims. Islamophobia is really, Islamophobic attacks have gone through the roof. France has enacted many right-wing policies. You can't even demonstrate against Israel now in France.
It's a crime to campaign to boycott Israeli goods.
You can demonstrate against any other country in the world except Israel and France. You cannot demonstrate against police brutality in France. So they've enacted these extremely draconian right-wing laws, but they haven't stopped the terrorist attacks.
No, they've traded liberté for sécurité, but they gave up the liberty and didn't get the security. Are they going to dig this hole even deeper?
I think they haven't got a policy. I mean, the thing is that, they're bombing Syria now, they're bombing Raqqa, bombing Daesh, supposedly. But I think they just want to be seen to be doing something. France just doesn't have a policy whatsoever. I mean, I think it's personally quite... I see these attacks, in a nutshell, as imperial blowback. I mean, France has a history in Algeria, a very sordid history. More recently, it bombed Libya, and, we see the anarchy now in Libya, Mali, but also Syria. It encouraged the destabilization of the Syrian state. Now, all these extremists, I call them Takfiri forces, that are rampant now in the Middle East especially, but also in Europe, are a product of the destabilization of states such as Iraq and Syria. Once you get rid of a central authority, that's what happened. You unleash these forces of extremism.
Can I just touch upon what you call Daesh? Because our previous guest also started referring to ISIS as Daesh. Now, as an anthropologist, I believe that language is culture, and therefore the media keep on repeating ISIS, Islamic State. It echoes in society, and therefore people, perhaps like you, choose to use the word Daesh. Is that conscious with you?
Well, I want to call them whatever they don't want to be called, and they don't want to be called ISIS. They don't want to be called ISIL, they don't want to be called Daesh, really. They just want to be called Dawla Islamiyya, Islamic State, because that's what they consider themselves to be. But often, obviously, they are rejected by 99% of Muslims all over the world. So I think it's important to delegitimize them in every sense, and of course language is an important aspect of that.
Now, Belgium has moved centre stage in these events. You lived in France. We both know how permeable the French-Belgian border is. What's the state of play for Muslims in Belgium now, or more importantly, what's it going to be tomorrow?
Well, I think all across Europe, when these terrorist attacks occur, you see a clampdown on ordinary Muslims, not just terrorists or people that may be prone to terrorism. You see the net cast so wide that the innocent are put in the same basket as the guilty. The radicals in the same basket as the moderates. So what I expect to see is not only a clampdown on terrorists and people where there is intelligence that they are on the verge of committing a violent act, but also on peaceful dissidents, so-called non-violent extremists, ultimately, and social conservatives as well, whose views may not be palatable towards, but to Western liberals, but ultimately these are not people that are going to commit violence or incite violence.
Thus deepening this pool of alienation that I talked about. We had this experience in the north of Ireland for decades. If you criminalise, marginalise an entire society on the grounds of ethnicity or religion, lock them up, internment, which we did in the early 1970s, what you're actually generating are new recruits and new forces for extremism. The same must be true in this Islamophobic atmosphere.
I think French Muslims, British Muslims, we feel as though the state, we feel as though the state does not represent us, the media doesn't represent them. That's why I started my own website to cater for British Muslims, because the mainstream media doesn't get our views across. And that's a very dangerous situation when, 5 million Muslims in France, for example, feel as though this is a white country. This is not a country for brown people. It's not a country for people who have religious values. On every single socio-economic indicator, French Muslims are right there at the bottom. They feel they have no future. So when somebody offers them the adventure of a lifetime in Syria or Iraq, and often you have this kind of Wahhabi Islam creeping in as well, funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar especially, when you add that into the mix, it's a very dangerous cocktail indeed. And when you have vast swathes of European populations hating their own country because they feel their country does nothing for them, that can only go down very dangerous avenues.
Now, in Britain, those stats are different. There's just less than 2 million Muslims in Britain, not 5 million like France. Many Muslims are not at the bottom of the socio-economic pile here in Britain. Yet the feeling of alienation, irrespective almost of the economic position, is the same, because it's a culture of feeling that you are being blamed. No one who looks at a picture of the Ku Klux Klan imagines that these people are representative of Christians. Why then do so many people, when they look at a picture of ISIS, imagine that these people are representative of Muslims?
Well, we get asked to condemn everything. Any atrocity which happens anywhere in the world, all Muslims seem to have to apologize for it. Like I have anything to do with what happened in Paris or what happens in Syria or Iraq. And it's this notion of collective responsibility, which, even someone as eminent as Peter Oborne, yesterday I heard him say, Peter Oborne is somebody who's sympathetic towards the Muslim community and writes stuff about Islamophobia, which is very progressive. But even I heard him say yesterday that ultimately we have a terrorist threat in this country and it's coming from the Muslim community, or something to that effect. Maybe I'm paraphrasing it in an unfair way. But ultimately, it's not as if we're harboring these people. It's not as if we're hiding them. It's not as if we're not telling the authorities about violent incidents that are going to take place. These people are the child of French imperialism, Western imperialism, and they've got nothing to do with my religion. They are an insult to my religion. They drag my great religion through the mud every single day. Radicalization has several factors. One, and I would say the major one, is foreign policy. The biggest thing you could do to stop the bombs going off in London and Paris is to not bomb Syria and Iraq, or generally just go a much more ethical foreign policy, which is something that most people in this country believe in, not just Muslims. Secondly, you have to address the problems of media Islamophobia, disenfranchisement, racism. I would say perhaps 10% of the problem. Perhaps the Muslim community can do a little bit more. I think we have been asleep a little bit in terms of the encroachment of Salafi Wahhabi Islam coming to dominate British Islam. Now, I'm not saying that is a slippery slope towards terrorism. I don't think there's the connection is that direct. But I think it is an intolerant brand of Islam, and I don't want to see it dominate British Islam. I want to see the Sufis, the Shias, the Barelvis, the Deobandis, and the Salafis, they're all part of the fabric of British Islam, and I don't want to see any of them dominate over the other. I want to see a diverse Islam. That's the way I like it.
Well said. Thanks very much, Roshan Salih. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in Paris, where do we stand, Britain as a country? Elizabeth says, I would be in favour of action if it did some good, but I've got serious doubt this will. I fear that we could experience reprisals like 7/7. And then she continues, saying, Western intervention in the Middle East has always been a disaster, from dividing Ottoman Empire to the more recent Iraq wars.
100 years of failure.
And Takes then says, like 9/11, the NATO are using this atrocity in Paris for their own devious and dishonest ends.
Well, that's certainly true, but we have to set aside past differences now and come together against the main enemy of all of us, of all humanity, which is ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We'll have to return to other issues. We're dealing with a symptom and not a cause. Exactly. That's for sure.
Exactly.
But if you don't staunch the flow of blood from the symptoms, you're not going to be alive to deal with the cause.
And that's all that we got time for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.